The first slide, it's very difficult to see this, but this is basically magnified times 100. And it just shows a skin biopsy of Kaposi sarcoma that was sliced thin, colored, and magnified to 1,000. I don't know if these will show, but what I'm going to show you now is when you magnify the tissue to 1,000 times, which is basically putting some oil on the slide and using your oil immersion lens, you will see these little tiny forms in the forms of granules. These tiny forms, in my opinion, are bacterial. Thank you, that lighting is much better. And it is stained with the same kind of staining that you would use for tuberculosis or leprosy. And Dr. Livingston has often said that these cancer germs have some relationship to the germ of TB and leprosy. Here is another picture of the germ. This germ lives within the cell and also outside the cell, intracellular and extracellular. This is a nucleus here of a cell, and these little rounded things are red blood cells. So you can see that these little tiny particles are much, much smaller than blood cells, and that if they were any smaller, you wouldn't be able to see them at all. This is another case of Kaposi sarcoma in a gay man with AIDS, and again you can see these round little grainy forms in the tissue. Again,
can I ask you?
Sure.
Researchers just ignore this.
Oh, they say it's junk or it's nothing or it's
spots
a mast
on the lens
cell.
or whatever.
Here we actually see in the tissue of Kaposi sarcoma from a man who was like 3 days before death. You can see these forms within the tumor. These forms are completely neglected. And when the man died, it was very interesting because there was no culture done of the tumor, because doctors say, why would you culture a tumor? There is nothing to find. And if you find something, they will tell you it's a contaminant. So you lose both ways. But nevertheless, at death, they finally found a positive blood culture. And I just show you, this is a Streptococcus germ, Streptococcus G, that was cultured from his blood, which they didn't pay any attention to because as he was near death, you know, all kinds of germs supposedly crawl in. But what I'd like to show you at the same magnification, if we go back, if you look at the size of this and then look at the size of the germ we grew, there certainly is a similarity. I'd like to show you another case. Here's another gay man with Kaposi sarcoma. These are the tumor cells, and here are 3 foci of those forms. And again, when we cultured the tumor, in this case, we did a skin biopsy and culture, and it turned out to be what the laboratory called a coccobacillus or a Corynebacterium, which is a common germ. And again, if we backtrack and you see the size of the microbe, the little grainy stuff in the tissue, and look at what you cultured from his skin, they're very similar. And I was always taught if you see a germ in tissue that looks a certain way, and you grow a germ from that tissue that looks the same way, well, maybe there's a relationship between the two. And it's interesting because cancer researchers expect a cancer microbe to be something new. And basically, cancer microbes are the kind of things that we deal with all the time very well. But when we become ill, these microbes then change and then become what I and what Virginia thinks are pathogenic. So we handle them well when we're healthy, but when we are unhealthy, and certainly if you were to have AIDS, we now know that common germs that don't bother normal, healthy people can be devastating in the absence, in the presence of a damaged immune system. It is interesting that these forms can also be seen in the type of stain that the pathologist uses routinely. And here we'll see in these forms here, there's a few down here, and another view, how they hover around the cell here. And the biopsy showed, again, a Staphylococcus type germ, which if you backtrack, look at this, and then look at this with the culture, are very similar. And here is the same culture which is stained like you would for tuberculosis, and we showed 2 forms, an acid-fast form, which means it picked up the stain and turned reddish, and a non-acid-fast form. And I just show you these because it shows that there are things to be seen in cancer tissue, and that these obviously play a role. You know, as John would say, there has to be something more. And so even though I believe very strongly in the AIDS virus, what I believe it does is it sets you up for all this other stuff, including these microbes that have been talked about in cancer.
One of the reasons that this theory has never achieved acceptance is because if in fact cancer was a microbe like this, it would be infectious. But of course, now in a sense, cancer is infectious. So you begin to wonder whether or not again, it's back to the question of what's the true cause? Is it this microbe, or is it some other portion of tissue or DNA that's the cause that's being transduced by some little agent? Virginia has always thought that this microbe was the true cause of cancer. That's one of the basic differences and arguments between the pleomorphists and the sort of unicellular people, or the cells who say that microbes of any sort don't cause cancer and cancer is never infectious. Well, we know for sure now that some viruses will cause cancer and leukemia and that they're infectious. So, we're halfway home in a sense as to the understanding of, is this possible?
But it also shows we've been wrong for a century by telling people that cancer is never contagious. And now all of a sudden, we had the so-called gay cancer that everybody says, oh my goodness, that's contagious. But if you said to a doctor, what about all the other kinds? And they say no. It just shows you that we know, as these gentlemen are saying, we really know very little.
Well, as you know, Dr. Virginia, it takes from the urine of the patient and creates a vaccine.
That's right.
And has been highly successful in the cure of many forms of cancer.
But she's also considered to be a crazy lady by 99% of doctors who have heard of her.
Right.
Which is sad. It's very sad to me when you see this with your own eyes and you don't wish to investigate that, especially when we're dealing with an epidemic. Now, you can see this germ not only in the lesions. If you start to, I just showed this as a briefing, but if you were to look at the swollen glands, for instance, the swollen lymph glands, you will see this microbe. If you look at the liver, you will see it. If you look in the heart, you will see it. So that these germs, I think, contribute greatly to the wasting. Because let's face it, AIDS patients towards the end start to look like cancer patients or like tuberculosis patients used to look years ago. So there is a relation here which the medical profession has completely denied. It's unfortunate.
Are you stating that according to this theory of the multiple forms, that the bacteria can move into the virus and the virus into the bacteria?
That's the theory of pleomorphism. But the question is, in the case of AIDS, the retrovirus is certainly pleomorphic because it has more than one form. It's more than a virus. It incorporates itself into your genes. So pleomorphism as an entity, say, in the case of the retroviruses is absolute fact, unless you don't believe in retrovirology. Well, pretty soon we don't believe in anything. But in this case, I think it's now going to have to be accepted that pleomorphism, and at least of that sense, is real. The pleomorphists have said that this organism is the true cause of cancer and that it has many forms, a bacterial form, a virus form, a fungus form, and different forms. So, and they say that's what the true cause of cancer is.
You see, it's very important because at the present time we are devoting all our research money towards a vaccine for the AIDS virus. Now it may be, if the AIDS virus weakens you and then kicks off some of this stuff, if we were able then to control this, which we don't even conceive of at this point, this may be another way to stop the progression of HIV, which gets into Duisberg's argument that this AIDS virus can't produce all of this, it takes something more. Well, I think the something more is this, but nobody knows anything about it, and nobody cares anything about it, and nobody will look under the microscope. And it's very maddening to think that scientists, who have claimed that cancer is not infectious for 100 years will not, get out their microscopes out and look again, especially when this stuff is so potentially so important in terms of possibly treating the patient.
Well, when and which cancers do you treat as a bacteria or as a virus or as both?
Well, all cancers basically that you study will have this stuff in it, and
this bacteria.
This bacteria. It's not specific, for Kaposi sarcoma or AIDS.
But when does this become the virus or a virus?
Well, I think that the AIDS virus, I personally think it has been created or manufactured or whatever, but it doesn't have any relation to this per se. In other words, you can take viral elements and then you can play with them in your laboratory and make all kinds of things that after a while start to have, they basically may have had an origin in this, but after so long, we are hardly closely related to Adam and Eve anymore. But, we theoretically started somewhere, so that the further away you get, the less the two have relations.
Well, yeah, in a sense, a traditional viewpoint, this is the pleomorphism theory, and I sort of consider myself a traditionalist, but I guess more people don't consider me traditional, but I attempt to approach this subject with a rigorous scientific viewpoint. The history of pleomorphism is the one area I can't still integrate into my thinking as far as making it make sense. But I can tell you that the vaccine that Virginia uses to vaccinate her chickens against aroused sarcoma virus, or the virus that's producing leukemia in chickens, was produced from a human breast cancer. So again, it sort of boggles your mind when you say, how do we make a vaccine from a human breast cancer that stops a retrovirus or some other strange virus that's growing in chickens? I mean, you see, that's where you begin to wonder is maybe it isn't the virus that's doing it, maybe it's this organism, and their vaccine is stopping this organism. And if you stop this organism, perhaps you don't get cancer. So she says the vaccine from humans will stop cancer in chickens. Well, it might stop cancer in humans. Perhaps. I don't know. This is where I sort of, this is the area of yeah, I fade out here. I can't.
There's a loose end.
I fade out on the virology, he fades out on the bacteriology.
Well, John, tell us about AZT, a drug used to treat AIDS. Does it actually cause AIDS?
It's a great question. I'm sure there's a lot of researchers that love that question. Does it actually cause AIDS? Well, AZT was introduced after a series of tests by the FDA as being kind of a compassionate drug for people who were very ill with AIDS. And they thought that it would stop the replication of the HIV virus and it might prolong life for a while. Well, we now have some pretty good articles that have been written about those trials that the FDA carried on. And the standards by which they released the drug are very suspect. That is, it looked like in this study that people who received AZT who were very ill stayed alive, while people who received the placebo, meaning the nothing pill, died at a much faster rate. So on seeing that, the study was stopped. The FDA almost overnight licensed the drug for use among very ill AIDS patients. And they were off and running with a tremendous amount of AZT being sold throughout the United States and the world to AIDS patients. Well, it turns out several things. There are other AZT studies that show other relation between the people who took AZT and the placebo, that more people who took AZT became more seriously ill or died, or that less people who took the placebo died. So that's kind of like plucking that one study out and saying, this is the one we'll use to license the drug. Makes you wonder again about the pharmaceutical implications here. But the second thing was that according to several sources, including a source within the FDA, what they call the double-blindedness of the study was unblinded right away. That is, people discovered immediately whether they were taking a placebo or AZT, because the capsules tasted different, for one thing. And you have to remember that the people who came into that study to test AZT were ill. So they weren't saying, you know, in the interest of science, I'm quite willing to die. I just want you to find out if AZT works or not. You know, so if I get the placebo, why, I'll just be a good guy and lie here and die. This does not happen in studies so much anymore because people are a lot hipper than they used to be. So they go into these studies and they say, hey, you taking the placebo or the real thing? And they start to compare notes, or they take their pills to a chemist and they find out. See? And according to several sources, this is exactly what happened in the trial that eventually ended up licensing this drug for use. Well,
are you saying because they knew they had the placebo, they died?
No, what I'm saying is that there was such a confusion that resulted, you see,
from... But no, that's a possibility.
Well, it's a possibility, of course. If you were desperately ill and you knew you were receiving a placebo, if you stayed with the placebo, you might say, I accept death. But what I'm saying is something more confusing to the people who ran the study. it was no longer possible to differentiate between the people who were taking the placebo and the AZT because they were exchanging information and drug. It wasn't a clear-cut issue anymore. You couldn't say this guy's taking AZT. No, they were combining and mixing, and some people were taking a drug from Mexico called ribavirin that they brought in because they wanted to stay alive from another drug while they were taking this drug. It was a mess, you see. But anyway, the drug was licensed for use. Well, if it was a harmless or relatively harmless drug, okay. But no, they knew that this drug caused severe anemia. The people who took it in the study had to receive multiple blood transfusions just to stay with it long enough to take the drug. In other words, the drug was beginning to act on the immune system in a very serious way. Also, bone marrow damage, and we know that certain components of the immune system are manufactured in the bone marrow. So essentially, to a 15-year-old biology student, if you put this puzzle in front of him, he would say, gosh, it sounds like you're giving a drug to people to help their immune system, but the drug damages their immune system. And of course, everyone else, this is one of these things, you know, it's too incredible to believe, so everyone said, well, that's ridiculous, they would never do that, and you know, they wipe your hands, and that's the end of the issue. But the drug became licensed, it became used first with severely ill people who were diagnosed as having AIDS. Okay, step 2. December 21, I think, 1987, an article breaks in the New York Times, front page, AZT scandal. Doctors all over the United States are now giving AZT to their patients, even if they test positive for HIV but have no symptoms. Okay? Not just a few doctors, but a lot of doctors. Suddenly, AZT, which had not been very available, you know, Burroughs Wellcome, who manufactures it, was charging you roughly $8 to $10 grand a year to take the drug. It was very scarce, you see, and suddenly, magically, whatever, it's available in a more wide way, and doctors are, you know, passing it out like rose water. One of these doctors says, well, I gave it to my patient because, you know, he wants to feel that something's being done for him. So I gave him the drug because he wanted me to give it to him. This is, so we have
like politicians.
Yeah, it's amazing. So we have people all over the country. They're taking AZT. Not only this, but AZT is being promoted as the only treatment for AIDS. In other words, if you are a down-the-line AMA guy, the party line is you may only treat AIDS with AZT. For opportunistic infections, of course, we have other drugs, but for HIV, we only have AZT. Now, it's been suggested that we treat babies with AZT. Okay? 1 week AZT, the next week interferon. Now, interferon, if you read up enough on it, you see that it's a double-edged sword. There are apparently some effects that can be kind of interesting and good in people who are ill that are given interferon, but there's a downside. If you administer interferon to people, they can actually get some of the symptoms that are on the list of AIDS symptoms, and they can just generally get sick. Now, I spoke with a researcher about this, and I said, what's your opinion as to why people are now suggesting that they give babies interferon?
Is this babies with AIDS?
Babies with AIDS or babies who test positive for HIV but have no symptoms. Okay? AZT week 1, interferon week 2. AZT week 3, interferon. And his answer to the question was, well, you know, the pharmaceutical companies in the 70s, when they came out with interferon, it was supposed to cure the world of everything, and then, of course, you don't hear anything about it anymore. What happened to it? Well, what happened to it is it didn't do what they said it did, and they've got huge unsold stocks of interferon around. So why are they giving out interferon? Because they want to get rid of the drugs that they've got, you know, stockpiled. That's why. Okay?
And that's in your book, AIDS Inc.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, let me interject something here about interferon and VISNA. Interferon's been investigated in the treatment of VISNA for about 25 or 30 years, and it's never, ever stopped VISNA.
In sheep?
In sheep, yeah. So you can predict that interferon will do nothing for AIDS. Now, you can't, you know, you have to prove that, but you could predict that, if in fact AIDS is a recombinant of bovine and vizsla.
On top of this, it's important to look and just see this one fact. If a very questionable drug called AZT becomes the treatment of choice for AIDS patients, then you know one other thing, and that is that all the treatments that you've never heard about, which have been developed by doctors researching independently, who can't get their articles published in journals, are completely written out of the equation. In other words, we not only are giving this incredible drug called AZT to people who are sick, but we are legislating against the use of independently evolved solutions to this problem of illness among people. That is becoming illegal. Quack associations are being formed by attorney general's offices with the AMA in certain states to start looking into people who are treating people for AIDS to make sure that they are using approved treatments.
The same is true of cancer.
Same is true of cancer.
There's only a couple approved treatments.
Absolutely.
For
So the same, it's a replay of that story.
and it's law. You have to treat cancer with those treatments.
The law may be around the corner, but at least we know there are investigations now about people who are, becoming alternative people. And Bob can tell you, Alan can tell you, I can tell you, I've got drawers full of stories about people who have been, let's say, remitted of AIDS symptoms, cured of AIDS symptoms, have no AIDS symptoms anymore, feel a lot better, don't care whether they have AIDS symptoms or did have AIDS symptoms anymore. They don't care what they test. They feel better, they're living better, they're healthy from other treatments which you don't read about, from other protocols. Such as we have some people who have simply decided to change their lifestyle. In other words, they were heavy drug users and they said, this is kind of crazy, right? Very simple. Many others such as besides that.
Well, let's name a half a dozen.
Okay, well, we have ozonation of blood, okay? This is a process by which you kill certain microbes. In fact, it's a purification of blood treatment, okay? There are corporations in Germany using this treatment to kill viruses, and HIV viruses, all viruses in blood. We have a physician in New York named Stephen Chiesa who's been treating people for AIDS as if it were undiagnosed syphilis. I have a list of 125 patients he's been dealing with, their symptoms before and after, the clinical signs, the blood work, and so forth. And amazingly, none of these people, one person has died after a year. Many people are in much better shape with their blood symptom work and also their symptoms. We have a guy out in Long Island named Catapano, I think, who has developed a protocol using the typhoid vaccine and penicillin, who's reporting that people's Kaposi sarcoma lesions are flaking off and blistering off like old skin. We have some stories that Bob knows about of other modalities of treatment that are working. What was the guy at the National?
There's a guy named Ravisi from New York who's treated many cancer patients who have been sort of left to die after their chemotherapy or RT failed, who is also treating AIDS patients and getting success. There's Cathcart in Northern California who's been using high-dose vitamin C along with other supplements. I mean, there are many, many different alternatives who have had achieved some success with AIDS patients as well as perhaps cancer. So there is more than just AZT.
I also know of a group of doctors in New York who are using the macrobiotic diet and having great success with those with AIDS.
And here's the thing that the doctors will tell you, or let's say the medical researchers, they will say, we got you, see, because no one of these treatments is working for everybody. In fact, in a controlled study, we find that some people it works with and some people it doesn't. I've been told, for example, somebody tried ozone on some AIDS patients, said, forget it, it didn't work. Meanwhile, doctors in Germany are reporting it works. Well, the thing to understand, and I really think it's important to, screw your brain tight down on this one, is that the medical research establishment has a theory, and the theory is that they must find one cure for all. See? This is their idea. If they can't do that, then whatever they do find is worthless. But in fact, the consumer movement called health, which is the biggest consumer movement in America, operates on a fundamentally different principle, and that is tear and compare. I don't feel good, I'm sick, I'm going to go out and try a number of modalities here. And if it works for me, I will use it. So just because it doesn't cure everybody of everything doesn't automatically disqualify it scientifically. You just operate on a different mindset. You don't accept the fact that it's got to cure everybody. And this is the hang-up where a lot of people get stuck. People come to me by the truckload when I say, you know, there are alternative treatments, and they say, oh, I knew a guy, he tried that, it didn't work. And I say, well, wait a minute though. What about the people it did work on? Well, but that's not scientifically valid. I said, well, it may not be scientifically valid, but these people are healthy today. It's okay with me. Is it okay with you?
It's always been interesting to me that the less toxic and the less ill the alternative treatment makes you, the more likely you are to be branded as a quack, and the more likely you are as to be say that this can't possibly work. Of course, the fact is, if you had, say, 10 or 12 non-toxic alternative therapies, which worked in a small percentage of cases, it could be that one of them might work for you. And of course, if it did, you'd have a non-toxic therapeutic cure. So if you look at the history of alternative medicine, it's interesting, and particularly in the case of the AIDS virus, which if in fact that this virus requires a cofactor, and the cofactors are all different, there'd be no reason to suspect that the cure would all be the same, unless you could in fact somehow cure the AIDS virus uniquely and then at the same time eliminate all the cofactors.
Well, if it adapts itself to each person,
that's
you're
right.
never treating the same virus.
Right, yeah.
So what it boils down to is the championing in America, the last stronghold of human and divine rights, the right to life, the right to health, the right to heal oneself, the right to acknowledge that one's body is a temple, is a laboratory, and that we have a right to experiment just as much and even more so than any scientist or doctor will say, I have the exclusive right to experiment on your body.
Right, it's great. The doctor says, well, you know, right. You can't experiment on yourself. You're going to let me do it.
It's a totalitarian view.
Absolutely.
And we have a totalitarian science, and it's a very creeping cancer in its own.
Right, in a sense, science is becoming official science. And the more that becomes so, the more that science is less free and more official, the more dangerous it becomes. That's absolutely correct.
I think we really have to consider AIDS really more like a war. I mean, you know, we're talking about all this madness of scientists putting all this genetic stuff together and creating things that they really don't know what they're creating. I mean, the fact that when Gallo had his virus, Montagnier said, I've got my virus over here in France and I've got mine in Washington, and Gallo said, that's not my virus. Montagnier says, yes it is. And you know, they just hold the thing for like 2 years. Then it turned out not only, you know, Gallo says your virus is different. And it turns out that they're not only similar, but they are like identical. And what does that tell you? I mean, when the two men that are the two shining lights, you know, can't agree when two things are identical, I mean, what does that tell you about the science of virology?
Well, where do they come from? How are these viruses traveling around the laboratories?
I'll give you a good story on this one. Here's the story. The ordinary conclusion from this is they were both working from the same sample. In other words, we know that Montagnier sent a sample to Gallo. This was before any virus had been identified as the cause of AIDS. We're talking 1983, so forth, 1982. And supposedly a separate sample, the sample was cultured and grown and whatever, or Gallo was working on his own sample that he had independent of the one that was sent to him, and he announced, here's mine, and of course Montagnier said, here's mine, and they both agreed it was similar enough to be called the same virus. But then other researchers said, well, let's look at these two samples. You know, supposedly we now know the cause of AIDS, so let's look and see the Montagnier version and the Gallo version. And they made their sequencing, as they say, their picture of what they look like, and they said, as Alan said, these are the same. This is not a mutating virus that changed a little bit. This is like, I handed it to you, and you looked at it, and you handed it back to me, and you said, you're independent, and I said, I'm independent, and we both independently arrived at the same conclusion. So I said, wait a minute, you're both passing the same sample back and forth. So I was told this story by a reliable researcher in New York. At the time that Gallo announced his HIV virus to the world, there was a workshop for science writers so they could get genned in on what this was all about, and scientists were there explaining the HIV virus, and this guy I know who's a researcher was there, and he was looking, and he saw the two pictures of the viruses, and he said to himself, these are the same, this is the same sample, what's going on here? This isn't two independently verified decisions. So he went out in the hall, and there was an American Nobel Prize winner out there who shall remain nameless, and he said to this prize winner, somebody's got to go in there and tell these journalists what's happening. This is a scandal. And the Nobel Prize winner said, don't do it. Please don't do it. Don't, in other words, let the public in on what's happening. We, the elite core of scientists, will handle our own dirty laundry among ourselves. This was the heavy implication. Don't let the public know, don't let these reporters know. It'll be handled. Of course, it's never been handled. Nothing ever is.
Tell them the story about the tissue culture guy that was at my lecture, Alan.
Will you tell them? Because
Okay, well, I gave a lecture in Pasadena at the Whole Life Expo recently, and there was a prominent member of the United States Tissue Culture Committee there who sort of buttonholed us outside in the hallway, and Alan was there, and what he said was that you can't tell people this. You can't tell this to the American public. And I said, why not? And he said, they're going to kill us. And so Alan, who was there, who can verify
but
that.
You see, these people can't really say that in public. They can come to you privately and say, we think you're onto something. But what people don't understand is that there is such a mesh in science between government, pharmaceuticals, the Department of Defense, medical institutions, hospitals, government money all over the place, solidifying all these people together. So, if you get a paycheck, as anything from the government, you can't really say, I think we really messed up. I think that this thing is out in the environment now.
Even more than that, John has had some, you found that the fact that people who work for the NIH or, say, the CDC have to sign a loyalty oath.
A loyalty oath?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
To science,
Not
I
a
hope.
science.
To truth, I hope.
No, to the institution.
To the institution.
There's 250,000 Americans that work for these various groups. 250,000 Americans who have been signed up for life to let them review what they're going to say before they're going to say it. So much of the stuff now is like secret, which I think, gets to this point, of a book like this called, Gene Wars, military control over genetic technology. I think the stuff that we're talking about is like the biggest threat to freedom that this country and the world has ever faced. Because if you don't like a group, all you have to do is seed something. Like I think that they did in the gay community in America and the black Africans. Just seed it and then let people love each other, and at the same time that they're spreading a virus that's going to kill them. And I think that sounds really sick and wacko. But I really think that's what we're doing. We're not spending millions of dollars a year splicing genes together. The purpose of that is to kill, mass numbers of people. And when you get something that's spread sexually, the one thing that gets us together, is sex.
Right. That's here. Let me just maybe we'll interdict some books here. This is a book, A Higher Form of Killing, by Paxman and Harris, Robert Harris, Jeremy Paxman. This book, The Secret Story of Chemical and Biological Warfare in the United States, Higher Form of Killing, was just published recently. It documents over 300 biological experiments that were conducted on United States citizens without their knowledge or consent. That stems all the way from spraying Serratia marcescens bacteria in San Francisco. The investigator of that study concluded that every San Francisco resident inhaled an average of 5,000 microorganisms, to the spreading of certain ethnic-specific or weapons that could be potentially ethnic-specific. For instance, weapons that would affect blacks only, or some other group specifically. Here's another book that addresses that, two books that are interesting. This one is actually published by James Jones. This is the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, A Tragedy of Race in Medicine. This is the story of the Tuskegee experiment in which black men of this country who had syphilis in control groups were not treated with penicillin after it became available. And that was conducted in the offices of the Public Health Service, which is now, of course, the CDC. And so if you believe that the CDC is necessarily going to tell you the truth, then you better read this book and find out perhaps what they're really capable of.
And these black men in Tuskegee passed on this to their wives,
to their wives
and children,
and to their children.
who also died when they could have been cured.
That's absolutely correct. Right. Here's another book. This is called Clouds of Secrecy, The Army's Germ Warfare Test, Overpopulated Areas. This is by Leonard Cole, came out in 1987 recently, and addresses the same kind of issues of biological experiments conducted on United States citizens without their knowledge. It goes into great detail in the San Francisco study and in several other interesting studies, just for people, to verify that when we tell you that they do these sorts of things, that we're not just spoofing.
Don't you think it's strange that with all the theories of AIDS, primarily the green monkey, which has been now, I think, thrown out, that nobody ever wants to say, these retrovirologists who should know better, who are producing these things, in laboratories, injecting them into animals, watching the immune system be destroyed, taking chimpanzees at birth, feeding them virus-infected cow's milk, watching them in front of their eyes develop for the first time in chimpanzees leukemia and pneumocystis pneumonia, the so-called gay lung disease, producing that in their laboratories, and then not having any virologists in the country saying, gee, could it have been a biologic accident? Could one of these things got out? They used to have conferences where they would get together, and the prime purpose of these, the big wigs in biotechnology saying, what do we do if one of these viruses get out? Well, they made all these plans to do all these epidemiologic studies if one of these deadly viruses got out. Nobody ever said, well, maybe we shouldn't make deadly viruses that we have no idea how to treat or heal. No, they never said that. They just said, if one gets out, we will have these governmental agencies and the statistics, and we will know from the cancer incidences that there has been an increase in a certain kind of cancer. And we will have blood tests before and blood tests afterwards, and we will track the development and the reproduction of this virus within the population. What they haven't told you is that not only if you go back and track the AIDS virus in terms of blood tests, will you go back to gay men who in 1978 were injected in Manhattan with the hepatitis B vaccine. And then a couple of months later, cases of AIDS first developed in Manhattan. Is that a coincidence? And then that hepatitis B model, using thousands of gay men, not only in Manhattan, but a year or two later in San Francisco and LA, which are the epicenters of the disease, those gay men and their blood samples have become the model for the AIDS epidemic, because through the testing of those blood specimens, they were then able to track the AIDS epidemic. Now, is that just a coincidence that 10 years before they set up this whole thing, to do this, and then all of a sudden 10 years later they have it and they use it? Is that a coincidence? I don't think it's a coincidence. That's
exactly the subject of this forum when we return after this recess. But I would like to finish this segment of our forum by asking you to tell us, what is it in the gay lifestyle that produces the suppression of the immune system totally apart from the AIDS virus? If you could run through that for me.
Okay. Well, let me just preface this by saying that Unfortunately, if people are told that they may get an invariably fatal disease from a germ, and that once that happens, there is no cure, there's nothing they can do, the most they can do is to take AZT, that they shouldn't really bother about their health, you see, because the germ is going to do all the damage regardless of whether they're healthy, sick, or what, then if they are engaging in immunosuppressive activities, they're going to think to themselves what? They're going to think, why bother to change this? So this is some of the insidiousness that comes with pronouncing, we know this is invariably fatal, and we know that it has nothing to do with any other factors besides this virus. Okay, if you go down into the street where medical researchers don't really function very well, and you go into the so-called subset of gay men in New York, LA, San Francisco, who were very active in the gay bathhouse lifestyle in the 70s, you find that the combinations and quantities of drugs that paraded through the bathhouses was unprecedented in history.
Like the prophylactic use of antibiotics?
Yes, like the prophylactic use of antibiotics. For 10 or 15 years, a person would be continuously taking antibiotics every day against the possibility of maybe getting an infection when he was healthy, because he did encounter numbers of sexually transmitted diseases during, say, 4 or 5 years of life at the bathhouse, and so the habit of taking antibiotics eventually began to be, run on its own. But also, you have situations where, in a gay bathhouse, in a number of situations, you'd have a drug dealer on the premises, renting a room, selling anything from like MDA, crystal meth, Quaaludes, Valium for use at the end of the evening, inhalant nitrite drugs called poppers, which are some very nasty drugs. And they are marketed legally in this country except in 3 states as room odorizers. Okay? That's how you can buy them. I won't try to go into all the studies that have been done on some of these drugs to link them to immunosuppressive effects, but they have been done. But if you were to imagine taking all of these different drugs and more, heroin, cocaine, and whatever, you're now talking about large amounts of immunosuppression, bad activity. And I'm not really sitting here as an anti-drug moralist, believe me. As you'll see if you read the book AIDS Inc., I'm talking about people that take quantities of drugs over years that you would say, I would be dead 50 times over if I took those drugs. You see? Okay, so when this, I'll give you an example of the letter that the guy, you sent me this guy in LA. He said, look, this is a gay man. He knows the bathhouse scene. He said, crystal meth, which is injected form of speed, high-level methadone, you know. He said, I have friends that have come down with AIDS in Los Angeles. They've been diagnosed as having AIDS. I know about 90 people, out of which about 65 have been heavy crystal meth users. So I have gone to these people, and friends of mine, people I knew, and said, hey, don't you think this is kind of crazy? You know, because this could be endangering your life. Then time passes, a year, I go back to these people and I say, well, what's happening? And they say, well, I'm practicing safe sex now. So therefore, I can practice safe sex over a weekend and shoot as much crystal meth as I want, and I know that everything's fine. I mean, this is how even moderately good advice can be twisted by people who just don't get the message, because in quantity and combinations these drugs can be dangerous. And I'll give you one example from the IV drug community, which of course, this is completely overlooked, by the way, in the newspapers. The IV drug community is not really given the play that it deserves in the AIDS scenario, because roughly 25% of the AIDS cases that have been reported to the CDC in the United States have been IV drug users. And you would think that heroin would kind of, and everything else you can shoot, would kind of be like a 50-foot neon sign that epidemiologists would say, gee, I wonder if the drug has anything to do with the fact this guy's been... They say, no, maybe, let's see, sharing needles, that must be it, you know? All right, there's a drug that's been used in San Francisco in the 70s, synthetic substitute for heroin. It's called M3P. It's a synthetic manufactured in somebody's lab, and they sell it as heroin, and some people think that's what they're getting. Well, there is an adulterant in that drug called MPTP. And if you shoot MPTP once, there's a strong likelihood you will get Parkinson's disease. That's how serious this stuff is. There is a whole medical unit that's been established at the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center in California around such patients. They call it the Parkinson's unit, or the MPTP unit, whichever, and they sort of study this chemical version of Parkinson's that exists among these people that come in. Well, I called up there and I said, well, tell me a few of the symptoms of these people. And they said, well, they don't really suffer from the tremors of Parkinson's very much, so it would be hard to diagnose that from looking at them. But I said, well, do they lose a lot of weight? Oh, yeah. And they have muscle ache and fatigue and so forth, and they're in really bad shape. Well, if you go to the definition of AIDS, which we really haven't had a chance to discuss much, but the CDC definition of AIDS, you'll see this thing called the wasting syndrome. This means 10% more weight loss. So picture this. You're an IV drug using junkie. You shoot up this horrible drug with a contaminant in it, and you've got yourself a case of Parkinson's. You lose 20 pounds and you're going crazy. You go to a doctor who knows nothing about synthetic heroin or contaminants, and you walk in and you say, I'm feeling horrible. And he looks you over and he says, I see by your arms, my son, that you shoot drugs. And you say, yes. And he says, you're looking a little wan. You say, well, you know, I lost 20 pounds. IV drug user, that's a high-risk group, lost weight, 20 pounds, wasting syndrome, AIDS, right? Okay, make the diagnosis. And we are finding that some people are being diagnosed for AIDS because of many other of these chemical involvements. And unfortunately, when you don't play up this enough, it isn't just an argument about, well, is it chemicals, is it the virus, is it this, is that? If we get down to the human health issue, what you're dealing with here is you are allowing people the luxury of believing that these chemicals really don't affect the AIDS picture one way or another. So they feel, because many of these people, I believe, are people who sort of like to get what they think is permission to do what they're doing anyway, they will take this as an okay from society. Hey, it's the virus, I can keep shooting up, no problem. And so the situation deteriorates more and more.
So there is a lifestyle problem.
There is a lifestyle problem. Unfortunately, there's a political problem that's squelched in here. And I've had this talked to me by gay activists who'll say, listen, if you try to say that it's chemicals and our use of drugs, you're going to bring down the whole thing again about it's all our fault. And my response to that is, listen, people are not that smart. The longer this idea of a viral plague that's uncurable and invariably fatal and it's going to kill everyone persists in this world, with our medical system the way it is now, the longer that goes on, you're going to get blamed anyway. Doesn't matter. The thing is to bring this to a conclusion somehow, because if you feel slighted or there's bad PR or propaganda, all that can be repaired. But if it goes on long enough, we're going to get into scenarios, political scenarios, that are going to make you feel that 1982 is a holiday.
They're going to be nasty.
Right.
Yeah, let me interdict something here. I don't really believe, I believe that the lifestyle problem applies to everyone, not homosexuals uniquely. It has nothing to do with homosexuals. If this virus, in fact, turns out to be somehow a homosexual disease, well, then in my mind, that would prove that it was man-made and it was directed against a specific group. There has never, ever been an agent that is homosexual. And furthermore, as far as lifestyles of homosexuals, actuarially, there has never been any evidence that homosexuals were at increased risk of death up until now. So the homosexual lifestyle itself, in my opinion, has no bearing upon this disease or doesn't affect their actuarial risk of death. But the lifestyle that we're talking about that puts everyone at risk, and that includes homosexuals who use drugs or abuse other things, applies not just to them, it applies to all of us. So,
but I think that you're making a very specific point here, that there is this immune depression.
And I'm also making the point that, yes, I am, that we're talking about a specific subset of the gay community here. Since late 60s specifically, in a particular kind of setting, and that's basically what I'm talking about.
Yeah, because there are many studies that, I can show you studies which have looked at homosexuals that come out of other areas, of say like homosexuals from Ohio, whose immune status today is just as stable as a heterosexual cohort. So if you're going to look at that, I mean, what we're talking about is a particular subgroup of homosexuals. I'm sure, I'm confident I could produce for you heterosexuals who use the same substances or abuse the same drugs, who have the same problems. So, and again, it brings an interesting point. If you're talking about the immune system itself, it's as if the immunologist were going to have to reverse their entire thinking of the immune system. And I bring this point up. It's like building your muscle. If I exercise, does my muscle get bigger or smaller? Well, the immune system has always been sort of based upon the same theory. If you exercised it, the immune system would hypertrophy and improve. The same as if I exercise, my muscles don't atrophy. So the fact that now all of a sudden we're saying, well, for whatever reason, we're exercising the immune systems and they're atrophying, it's a whole new phenomenon. Well,
I don't think there was ever any evidence that the gay community was immunodepressed until the advent of the AIDS virus.
Right.
And I think a lot of this idea that, gay people are collectively sick is the same kind of, it's like racist science, only we're doing it against gays. I mean, when they did the hepatitis B vaccine studies, they were trying to develop a vaccine that would keep gay men from getting hepatitis, because they were saying, oh, you men, you have so many partners and you're all infected. They had no trouble getting over 1,000 men who had had sex with God knows how many people, who, despite all that, half of those 1,000 men never had a history of VD and never had any blood test reaction to hepatitis B. In fact, that's why they were chosen for the experiment. And within 1 year, those people who went out with multiple sex partners doing God knows what drugs, they were perfectly healthy until 1978, when that hepatitis B vaccine study began. And by 1979, those men were already, of the 1,000 men, 6.6 were infected the first year. So a lot of this myth, of gay people as being diseased is just baloney.
right, if you look at actual hepatitis B, the incidence among gay men is reported by Smunis as being quite high, and it was, but in the United States, the incidence of hepatitis B among men was highest in heterosexuals, and that was dentists, twice that of gays. So you must ask yourself too, why didn't they pick dentists to run the study in? They had twice the incidence, so.
We're going to stop there. Dr. Strecker, Mr. Rappoport, Dr. Cantwell, thank you for being the flame of freedom that speaks at Summit University Forum.
Thank you.
You've been watching Summit University Forum with Elizabeth Clare Potter. Summit University Forum, where the flame of freedom speaks.
We've come to halftime. We've laid a very sound foundation, and what's coming up next is the worst that has to be uncovered. So have a good meal, and let's get back as soon as possible.
If you have any questions about today's program, call 406-222-8300 or write Summit University, Department V200, Box A, Livingston, Montana, 59047, 1390.
I will never turn back. I will never